Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first joint property and transport virtual lunch event. I'm Adam Richmond, the chair of the Property and Infrastructure Sector Group for Pro Manchester, and I'm also an associate at Mott MacDonald, the Global Engineering Management and Development Consultant. It's amazing to have so many of you here virtually, but I'm sure we all can't wait until we're allowed to break bread with each other at one of the wonderful venues we usually use for events like this. Just like to start by thanking our very generous sponsors Together. Thank you for your support. And if you'd like to learn more about them, you can speak to Sean Williams, who'll be speaking at the end of the event. When putting this event together, we really wanted to capture, take stock of where we're at the moment, but also have a good look at the future of the region and see what we can do to build back better and help achieve the fabled levelling up agenda. I really hope you enjoy the fantastic array of speakers and panelists we have for you today. Firstly, though, I just want to talk about International Women's Day that was celebrated earlier this week. I'm really lucky to work for a firm that thrives on its diversity, and Pro Manchester is also the same. And Sam spoke to me earlier in the week actually about when she joined Pro Manchester, one of her jobs was for any event was to try and make sure that we had one woman at every table to try and mix things up and let alone have the fantastic array of female speakers that we've got at the moment. We try as hard as we can to make our events as diverse as possible, but we can't do it without your support. So as a bit of a call to action, please, if you've got anybody that you think would be a fantastic speaker or panelist, please let us know, and we'll look to include them in our events moving forward. So we're going to start with Paul Hammond, who is Global Lead for Infrastructure Development and Economics at Mott MacDonald, who's going to discuss the economic outlook and what the future holds for property and infrastructure. We'll follow that with a panel at about 12:25 with Paul, Anna Jane Hunter, who is a partner at Winder Phillips, Mike Wilton of Arup, and also the chair of the Manchester Climate Change Partnership. And the event and the panel will be chaired by Sarah Bandari, who is project director for Mott MacDonald. We'll wrap for a coffee break at around 1 o'clock. Followed by another panel session, and then we'll draw the event to a close at about 1:55. So onto the event. As I said, Paul Hammond is the Global Lead for Infrastructure Development and Economics at Mott's, and he's got over 25 years experience in local government and as a private consultant. He's led major economic assessments for the UK infrastructure projects, and he's delivered assignments for the IFC World Bank, European Commission and the EIB. He's also from Liverpool, but let's not hold that against him. So over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Adam. I'm going to try and do the clever stuff and share screen, so if someone can shout when they can see these slides, that would be great.
Yeah, they're on the screen.
Thank you. Well, welcome and thank you very much to Pro Manchester and our sponsors for asking me to give a bit of a talk today. Adam's already started on the Liverpool-Manchester rivalry. Let me say that I'm probably a rarity amongst Scousers in that I have equal affection for Liverpool and Manchester. I am a Scouse, yes indeed, but I spent much of my career and my education in Manchester. I was educated at the university. I've worked for several organisations, and I am currently our office leader on Portland Street for Mott MacDonald in Manchester. So thank you for that, Adam. I've put that straight. I've got a few slides and 20 minutes or so to speak. I'm going to simplify a lot of very complicated information as a mechanism to encourage discussion and debate. And I know from conversations with the panel in preparation for this event that they've got plenty of ideas. It would be great to use the chat function for people to chip in and have a conversation. The overall message I want to give you from that simplification is a good one, but I have a reputation for being fairly direct and challenging in how I do these presentations. So I will put some bumps in the road in front of you. So I'm going to say a few words on the state of the nation. What's the pandemic done to the Treasury? What's happening in terms of income and expenditure? And if you see that income and expenditure as your household, you'll see quite a challenging situation. We're then going to talk about how the UK government, from a public sector perspective, appraises and makes its investment decisions. And as I say, a very simplified approach to that. And you will have seen on the news, and Adam's already mentioned the phrase levelling up. What does that mean for rebalancing the economy, which was the phrase that was in common use until the latest government took power, between the North and South? And I don't want that to be a divisive thing. I think we all want the whole of the UK to prosper, but I'm raising the issue of what is the North's role in that. And then to leave you with a few philosophical underpinnings, not bad for a Thursday lunchtime. What is the philosophy in terms of how the government does that decision making about what investment it's going to make with public sector funds, and after all, what investment it's making with taxes collected from you and I. So that's the agenda. Let's have a look at this then. This is sourced as the 2020 to 21 projection from the Office for Budget Regulation. This is the central government's income and expenditure as forecast to the end of as this month, and it's been pretty accurate. So the government's going to get £786 billion worth of receipts in taxes of various forms from you and I, from businesses, etc., direct and indirect. As you can see, due to COVID, it's spending a considerable amount more than that, and there are other reasons than COVID. The requirement, therefore, is that the government borrows, in this case, £355 billion to top up to make that household income and expenditure balance, if you like. That's led us to having a national debt in excess of £2,198 billion. Wow, a lot of money. And as you can see there, that is actually greater than our gross domestic product, the measure of productivity and wealth of the nation. So anything we talk about in terms of levelling up North and South has to be seen in the context of that much bigger picture. And this is an interesting slide. It's not a Mott MacDonald slide. It's one I've pinched from the OBR. And as you can see here, this is being put together just post last week's budget. We've sort of delayed the recovery of some of that net borrowing. We're looking at the impact of net borrowing in the diamond shapes there. You can see that for this year and into next year, the financial years, that's on the increase. But gradually the plan is 2022-23 to start to bring it back down. You can see that the orange is investment allowances, household support, furlough, business support, etc., all being majorly expenditure items for the foreseeable future. But gradually the plan is to claw that back. Now there's a question about whether that is achievable, but I really like this diagram because it simplifies, as I say, a lot of information in terms of the Chancellor's plans to get us back and to repay that national debt. So I did do this presentation, by the way, about 2 months ago, and a similar version of it, and I was delighted that Pro Manchester asked me to come back and do it again to you guys in this session. Obviously, I didn't realise that in between there would be a budget and I'd have to do a bit more work to update the slide deck. But interestingly, having done a bit more work, going back and looking what I said a couple of months ago, number one, tax rises are coming for firms and households, not just yet. So absolutely spot on. The corporation tax rise for firms pushed into the future slightly, but it's coming. I'd suggest that households are going to suffer in one way or another going forward. We have to start being realistic about that household income and expenditure. Number two, there'll be a squeeze in spending generally, and a good example of that is we've already seen some reductions to the overseas aid budget. Again, a very politically controversial investment from the government. So whatever your views on that, politics to one side, that is being reduced. What we have seen, and Mott MacDonald and Mike from Arup on the call and others involved in infrastructure development, etc., is that spending on some of the big projects, HS2, Highways England, continues to go forward. And that is one of the multiplier methods that the government has used to prop up the economy. How are we paying for all that difference in income and expenditure on the previous slide? So you've probably heard of the phrase quantitative easing. It's item number 3 there. The Bank of England's printed 745 billion. Yes, I did say that. 745 billion of new money and put it into the economy by buying back bonds from the private sector. What does that actually mean? It means, number 4, the government owes itself, in effect, that 745 billion as part of the 2,200 billion debt. It pays interest to the Bank of England, and in absolutely oversimplified terms, it's paying interest back to itself. So in reality, if you're the householder there, if you're looking at your household income expenditure, it's not so bad. There's no big challenge on the short-term horizon of foreclosure on that debt, for example. The official position, as it says there, is that debt is a bad thing, and one day, quantitative easing will have to be unwound. But there's no possibility of that in reality for the foreseeable future, unless we go into extreme austerity and the dark days of George Osborne trying to pay back the national debt in general. Let's give a further illustration of that. We've just about paid, after 75 years since 1945, the debt we owed in terms of the Second World War. And I think it's interesting to see COVID as that sort of impact on our economy and our national debt and borrowing requirements. We have to pay it back over a very, very long period of time. The budget last week was very positive, in my opinion. I think there is a roadmap for recovery. I'm pleased to say that I have had my vaccine, and so it is happening. It's not a mystery thing, and hopefully others on the call have had the same privilege. Absolutely brilliant to see the National Health Service front and centre delivering that. The rescue period's been extended. As we saw, no payback corporation tax rises delayed for another year or so. And the position is not so bad as OBR forecast earlier in the year. So there are still risks to the recovery, but I personally am very positive. Mark McDonald is very positive that that recovery is well underway. I have to say, wash your hands, keep your distance, be safe, etc. All those things still apply. And on a personal level, one of my friends just last week was diagnosed with COVID. So it's still out there, it's still a threat. But in terms of our economic recovery, all positive, but the note of caution around the fragility of that. So what? What does the government mean by levelling up? And this is me, as I said earlier, starting to get a little bit challenging. How is that going to work in terms of the appraisal system, the new future that's been promised by levelling up, and historically by rebalancing and by previous governments with issues like Northern Powerhouse, TransPennine, etc. How are we going to deliver this new future? How will be that appraised? Thirdly, a challenge that I'm not going to go into detail, but paraphrasing Bill Clinton, the economy stupid. Compare what we're doing in the UK, and this is just a base figure, but 1.9 trillion stimulus package from the new Biden administration. So is our investment in the UK's economy going to be big enough? I think that is a challenge. My own opinion is that, for example, the 10-point plan for a green industrial revolution is an excellent plan. Its contents are sound. The scale and the pace of the plan, however, is what's in challenge, and that's what I'm putting on. Hoping to point out by item 3 there. And then finally, as I say, I'm going to conclude with this issue of rights versus utility. So Levelling Up Fund announced, and a bit more detail in the budget. So it was announced in the comprehensive spending review, 4 billion for England and 800 billion for the developed nations to focus on local transport, urban regeneration, cultural assets. Guidance is out in general, more specific guidance promised. Deadline for local authorities to lead this is June of this year. But deeper questions, I think we're still not seeing Levelling Up explained properly. The suggestion, particularly the way the government has tiered its approach, is that it's a spatial programme, but it could be about people, it could be about public sector spend as the measure of change, it could be about education, it could be health. And back to the Biden investment, there are in it approximately 400 councils across the UK. If they all were to apply, and as an average, £12 million, not going to touch the sides. What would it cost really then? It's all very well me saying Biden's done much better. He's gone large in terms of the Keynesian investment to stimulate recovery. The figures there in the middle column are from the Local Government Chronicle article. So if your measure of levelling up is public spending levels, so we're suggesting here that if you were to raise the average public spending level throughout England to the same levels as London per capita, that would cost £72 billion. And remembering that public sector debt probably precludes that. So again, I'm being very simplistic, but the reality is that the level on up fund at 4.8 billion, again, is probably insufficient. Comprehensive spending review of 2020 actually took levelling up a bit more seriously, I'm glad to say, and also took net zero carbon much more seriously, and I'm sure Mike will touch on that later. The government's approach to appraisal now includes much deeper analysis of levelling up, but there are still some doubts in terms of what that actually covers, what's in, what's out, hence my challenge in that first column around public sector spend, quality of life, etc. So how do we do appraisal in the public sector? And there's probably some experts around the table already, so forgive me, but maybe some people who might find this interesting and relatively new. So if I work for a private sector business, all things being equal, very simplistic, my role is to maximise the return to shareholders, dead simple. How does that work in the public sector? Well, there is such a variety and diversity of interests across the UK populations and regions and issues from energy, water, waste, transport, education, health, etc. It's a very complicated way. So the government has, to some extent, its Quran, its Bible, its Green Book approach to guidance on appraisal and evaluation. And it starts from the principles of what we call ROMEF. So what's the rationale for this spend on a new tram system, on a new hospital, on a new power station, etc.? What are the objectives associated with that? How do we measure them to deliver value for money? And importantly, and I think one of the weaknesses in some of the welcome changes to the Green Book going forward, importantly, how do they affect other sectors? Action, reaction. So if you build a new hospital, there are issues for energy generation, there are issues for transport, etc. And quite often our appraisal of these issues is done in silos, and that would be one of my criticisms of the Green Book approach. The Green Book's underpinned by something that we call the 5-case business model. I could go into complete jargon on this for you, but as you'll see, it starts with a strategic outline business case, which would cover, in essence, the green box there, greater emphasis on the strategy and that rationale. It'll then look at the economic case, a bit less so in the strategic level in terms of, is this value for money? What are the options that could deliver this? And there's a big challenge in there to compare apples with apples by monetizing, comparing the value of things in pounds and pence, as opposed to the greater challenge perhaps of how do you value net zero and climate change going forward? How do you value long-term health? Now, we as economists have incredible debates around this, but as I say, I'm simplifying a very complex situation. I'm not going to go into more detail on this. This is an iterative approach. This could take a year, could take 2 years. The scale of the sort of effort that goes into the 5-case business approach should be proportionate to the value of the investment from central government and indeed to the risk associated with that investment. Personally, the biggest business case I've worked on was a £40 billion space investment by the UK government that I'm very proud to say was signed off by number 11 Downing Street. I learned so much on that, but as I say, complex equals simple, simple equals complex. So back to levelling up in terms of how the Green Book works. This is a quote from the Metro Mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham, also an Everton fan, the same as me, I'm glad to say. This is when Andy was at the Treasury in the Labour government, and he's making the point here that the current approach to that appraisal takes no account of where higher social need might be better met. It really does work on very strong value for money, and I do believe that the tweaks that have been made to the Green Book appraisal system recently possibly don't go far enough. And whilst a little dated now, 18 months ago, really pleased to see that Marion Sensier and Diane Coyle from the University of Manchester produced a regional studies paper that outlines some of those challenges which underpin the big challenge of levelling up and how we appraise. So key considerations in terms of doing an appraisal. I'm trying to avoid public sector jargon. It is advisory. I mean, I've done some excellent business cases. I've probably done some not so good ones as well, to be honest. But the business case is my professional opinion and is used to inform decision makers in an open and transparent way. I'm very privileged at Mott MacDonald to be an economist who can draw on hydrogen specialists, who can draw upon water waste specialists, etc. And we build the economic case and can do that comparative analysis in conjunction with those technical specialists in infrastructure development. It's also really important to state that appraisal, the business case approach, is political. It is usually the minister or a senior leader in local government who, depending on where the business case and investment is going and coming from, who makes that decision. But civil servants are always obliged to remind ministers of what's known as their fiduciary duty, i.e., is this value for money? And I've seen examples where civil servants have reminded ministers that this possibly might be too political and it's not necessarily value for money. And I've also seen that ignored. So it is a very political situation. There are components of how the 5-case business case works that include technical issues that embed a north-south divide. So, for example, the use of market prices in determining the monetization of benefits. We all know, for example, that salaries tend to be higher in London and the southeast. The cost of living is higher. So if you put in job creation and GDP impacts as one of your benefits, the market prices, current prices, are likely to be higher in London and the southeast. And therefore, there's a built-in technical challenge to compare an investment in the south with investment in the north or more remote areas of the UK. Number 4, uncertainty. There's a great book from Mervyn King that was published about 6 months ago on radical uncertainty. And that's basically very timely. I'm sure Mervyn and the publishers are delighted because in the pandemic you couldn't have published a book about known unknowns and uncertainty in planning at a better time than COVID. I do think that our current appraisal system does not take enough account of those uncertainties. Again, at Mott MacDonald, we're working extensively, particularly with the Department of Transport, on what we call scenario planning for future uncertainty, bringing qualitative considerations, looking into the future, and really thinking, well, what does the evidence say in terms of the quantitative information, but what might happen? What do we need to be flexible enough and agile enough for in the future? And I think there's a big indictment of the appraisal system that decisions just take too long. HS2, Northern Powerhouse Rail, some of the big schemes, A66, etc. In the north, the appraisal process is slow. And we all know that in our modern day society, the Internet of Things means that information spreads really, really quickly. Decisions are instantaneous on the stock market, etc. Yet our appraisal system is slow. Now, there needs to be proper care in making these investment decisions with public money, but I would suggest that it needs to pick up the pace a little bit. So, government's level and up prospectus was produced in the last few days. A little bit more detail in terms of what it might cover. I'd suggest relatively small scale, demonstrable impacts on local cities and town centres, buildings, infrastructure, as a means to stimulate the issue that there is recovery from COVID, that something is happening, and to develop that soft confidence in our economy that makes a huge difference. I could be completely cynical and say, again, it won't touch the sides, but this sort of investment where people feel a difference, where they can build economic confidence, where a small business makes an investment decision, where Paul Hammond chooses to buy a new car, electric vehicle probably, that's the sort of thing that the economy thrives upon. There is a huge controversy around the characteristics and the categorisation of local authority areas. So, for example, parts of North Wales that are relatively well deprived are in category 2 and 3, whereas the Chancellor's constituency of Richmond, which is not deprived on anyone's in the seas, is in category 1 as priority for investment. As I said earlier, it's political. Really important that any schemes going forward for the June deadline are shovel ready, and I think that's a big challenge to Pro Manchester in this audience. Talk to your local authority partners and other investors about what can we actually get shovels in the ground before the end of next March. A real strong emphasis on that policy strategic case, and value for money is always going to be there. And a blatant advert, we at Mott MacDonald have invested massively in the Mott MacDonald Business Case Academy, externally accredited training of our teams so that we're ready to hit the ground running for international, national and local government and public sector, private sector entities looking for business case excellence. So there are other things happening. I'm absolutely gutted that the investment bank's gone to Leeds. Of course, Mott MacDonald has a major Leeds office, however, so we're looking for opportunities. But again, that bank will be working on the green agenda or transport agenda and working on levelling up generally. I think that is a huge opportunity to leverage its £22 billion worth of financial capacity to the benefit of the levelling up agenda. There's also the Community Renewal Fund, which is a make-weight fund in the short term, as a short-term stopgap replacement for funds from the European Union, largely around skills, enterprise, and some decarbonisation. And you may already be familiar with the Towns Funds, and that investment line continues. And an interesting commitment from the government to move 750 Treasury staff up to the north to Darlington. That's fascinating in terms of the economic multiplier that their household expenditure potentially brings to the north. I'd love to see a UKIB type investment in Liverpool or Darlington type investment in Manchester. It's really important that the whole of the north looks at where this relocation of the civil service might end up. So things to focus on now in terms of levelling up. Smart objectives, what you really want to do in terms of your rationale. Let's get them timed and measured, etc. That alignment with local, regional and national policy, particularly decarbonisation. That focus on, as I say, social and distributional impacts for levelling up. How are you going to make a difference to people in their lives? Shovel ready, I've already mentioned, and I think you need to be prepared if you're putting in funding requests with your local government partners for a more intensive challenge and dialogue with the Treasury on those submissions. The detailed guidance has not been published yet, but it's due any day soon. More positively, I'd love to tell you at length the stories of Lille and Chicago. I'm particularly fond of the Chicago one, but in terms of Lille, very briefly, I had the opportunity working for the European Commission out of Brussels a long time ago now, to go around Europe looking at what made the difference between a good and bad strategic investment in infrastructure from the European Commission and from national governments. And Lille is a shining example of how the TGV Eurostar station ended up at Lille. It ended up at Lille because of a very well-connected mayor, but he had the vision and the leadership and brought local and national and regional and European investors with him to make things happen. We've also seen the same in Chicago. I had the pleasure of meeting Emmanuel Rahm about 18 months ago, pre-pandemic, former mayor of Chicago and former chief of staff to Barack Obama in his first administration, an absolutely charismatic leader who dragged Chicago out of the depths of drug use, violence, and a really poor image to where it is today. Some of those problems remain, but it is for foreign direct investment in the top 2 or 3 worldwide cities. That's a remarkable transformation, and it was because of his vision and his leadership. And within that, one Manchester thinking, and I think Pro Manchester is a great vehicle for this. Collaboration is key. But let's be realistic. It's a political process. I think the scale of investments from the Levelling Up Fund and even from the investment bank is relatively small. So we really do need that private sector investment and the leverage that perhaps the bank and Levelling Up funds can bring. And you at Pro Manchester have to be part and parcel of this. And we are Liverpool, we are Manchester, we are Leeds, we are a proud northern community. We shouldn't be entirely looking to the government to give us grant aid to make things happen. Let's have some self-reliance. Okay, finally, and I'm sort of flagging a bit, beginning to run out of steam. Back to the philosophy. Look, here's the example. If you give free higher education as a right, it becomes irrelevant whether charging fees would produce a greater excess of benefits over costs. So, the current way that we do the investment appraisal in the economic case of that 5 case I've just mentioned is based on utilitarianism. The greatest good for the greatest number. That's how the Treasury sees things. The Treasury's latest report of cost benefit analysis decarbonisation sees that as exactly the matter. In 10, 20 years' time, they see a general levelling out and a utility in terms of what's happening in costs and benefits of going to a greener economy and a greener society. What they actually miss is the 10, 20 years worth of restructuring and structural change in industries and indeed in households and labour markets and the pain or pleasure that that might cause. So the rights-based theories are slightly different. Why haven't people in the north the same right to minimum transport standards as you might expect to find in London? And moving towards this rights approach, I think, is a better way, in my opinion, and it's not a Mott MacDonald opinion, I hasten to add, but a better way of bringing the levelling up to the appraisal process. I do not believe that the whole thing is affordable unless something is done to address that gap between north and south. I'm happy to participate. I'm happy to take comments. We've got a great panel here. Thank you for listening. And again, to emphasise, I have absolutely simplified some very complex issues there. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, Paul. Really appreciate your presentations and some really exciting points. But I'll give you a couple of minutes to actually catch up on your breath and maybe have a drink of water. Some interesting stuff in your presentation, and I'll ask the panel to actually respond to a couple of things. So one of the things that I've understood is to level up, it'll take a lot of efforts using multiple strands, both large projects as well as small projects to make it happen. But in the context that we are, and we're just coming out of a pandemic, and everyone knows and believes that climate change is the next big challenge that we are all ready to or should prepare for. Just in that context, Mike, if I could come to you first to say, what does building back better that Paul was talking about actually mean for you in terms of climate change?
Thank you very much indeed. And it's a great question. Building back better, building back greener. You mentioned sort of climate change is coming up. Climate change is here as a reality. It's been a challenge for us. To be fair, in the same way that the levelling up a need has been there for a number of years. But we can't use the pandemic and go back to where we were, because the world is going on. The Paris Agreement has set some pretty demanding targets of everyone in terms of emissions reductions in order to stop irreversible global warming. So we have to engage the climate agenda as a fundamental part of that. Now, the good news is that actually addressing the climate agenda also addresses a lot of the Build Back Better agenda. We need employment, we need skills, we need people to be living in warm homes. And so there is an opportunity to use the investments that the UK economy needs to make in terms of building back and recovering the economy to build back greener. And the classic example is housing retrofit. It is the largest area of emissions that the UK does not have a plan for. There's some huge economic challenges in there, but there's a massive opportunity in terms of employing people, the people who are going to come into your houses to make your home warm and efficient going forward. So local authorities in Manchester are really keen to take as many opportunities as we can to use building back as part of building back greener to get a program going where we can improve the marketplace, the supply chain of people to do domestic retrofit. That's just one example of the sort of things we can do to make building back greener.
Thank you, Mike. So on that, is there a tension between what are minor projects, really important from a policy point of view in terms of building back better, climate change, and actually a better quality of life for people in Manchester and surrounding area? Is there a tension between the shovel-ready schemes, the minor schemes, and the larger infrastructure spend, which will, of course, take time? So if you could respond to it, and if I go to Anna after that from an industry perspective.
I think as a tactic for cities in the UK, it is really important to work on your pipeline of projects. This week, the thing is on the levelling up agenda. There'll be another pot coming up in 6 months' time with a slightly different hat on. And what cities and smart cities do is have a list of projects that they will adapt and tweak to be ready for that bidding window. And so it's really important the cities get those sorts of things going. I don't see that tension between the long-term projects and the short-term projects. I think it's all part of a piece, and the piece is, we don't necessarily, taking the example of NPR, we don't want a railway between Manchester and Leeds. What we want is better connectivity between Manchester and Leeds. We want better employment opportunities. We want better social inclusion so that people in Bradford can access the opportunities in Manchester and Leeds, for example. So if we focus on the outcomes we're wanting from these investments, those are the same outcomes we'll get from investment in warmer homes, that we'll get in different things. Hang on to the outcomes, not necessarily the specific projects we're looking to try to use as a tool to get there.
Anna Jane, what's your view in terms of, is there a tension between the larger programs? And are the larger programs really ready for what we really need for the economy now?
Yeah, so I wouldn't describe it as a tension from a railway perspective, which is my outlook. I would say we're just not very good at being shovel ready. We've proven again and again as an industry that we just are no good at maintaining that pipeline. We aren't shovel ready when we need to be. And actually, if we look back over the last 12 months of the pandemic, we've done some stuff. We've cashed in on the opportunity to an extent, but I think we'll probably look back in the fullness of time and wonder whether we could have done more whilst we had such a drop in passenger use of the railway. Could we have, really jumped on the opportunity? Because disruption is obviously something that we don't want to cause people who are using the railway and freight users. Have we done enough? Maybe not. And so that's something I think we need to continue to get better at. The long-term vision is there, and the mega projects are continuing to get the political and the financial support. But there's some stuff we need to do in the meantime. And building back better for the railway isn't just about some of the things that you've described there as at a national level and a macro level in the economic sense. It's actually about building back a better railway for passengers and freight users. And that means things like performance, day to day, and we need to have that on our agenda as well.
Okay. On that, do you think that some of the larger programs, we hear about High Speed 2 and Northern Powerhouse Rail and other larger highway schemes in the region, is the business case for them still valid, given people are rethinking the way they commute, they travel, they use the public transport system? And does that require a major rethink from your understanding of the industry? So
I think it's a really interesting question. And I thought Paul's explanation of the philosophy behind how we invest in the investment pipeline, which we obviously have in the rail industry as well, and the 5 stages apply to all of us. We have some quirks in the rail industry around things like the PDFH, passenger demand forecast handling, how we value performance, which I just mentioned, how we build that into our business case. These were things that we had problems with, we had questions around before the pandemic. I think some of them are even more prominent now post-pandemic in terms of how do we value the pound of a passenger in the north of England versus the pound of a passenger in the south of England. Have we got that right? As Paul alluded to, actually he was quite explicit about it, the Green Book probably hasn't gone far enough in its changes in that sense. I'm a northerner, I would say that. I think we need more investment in the north, but some of those calculations and some of those assumptions, I think we've got a long way to go. And all the pandemic will have done is to amplify them and to sort of, maybe even complicate them even more because some of those assumptions really are flawed. To HS2 and NPR and TransPennine route upgrade, do we still need them? Yes, but I've long since said, and have said at forums like this and maybe even this forum before, they're not and/or decisions. We actually need them all. We shouldn't be choosing between these things. We need them all.
Thank you. Paul, if you now rested, I'd ask you a question to say, all of this leveling up and this money that we see is available to, I would say the North, but especially in our case, the Manchester PLC. What do we as Mancunians and generally Northerners need to do in order to access it better this time? Because these monies have been available in some form or the other in the past, but we've sometimes not had the fair share. What is it that you'd suggest we need to do to get the fair share of levelling up?
I think in the past, Manchester's been pretty good at doing this. You know, some of the growth deals historically that have been achieved, and some of the deliverables. I think Manchester needs to look at the government agenda and interpret it through its own lens. You know, things need to make a difference to Northers and to Manchester. But Mike's right. You know, the green economy is the big new thing. It's been around for a long time, but the government's now starting to invest in it and back it and push it. So for me, the Manchester ambition, as the combined authority and others are already doing, obviously, has to be world leading in green energy, in green industry, etc., green finance, and to play its role to Manchester's strengths. Really, really important. We have to make sure that our local policies complement those national challenges. As I've already said, Saurabh, the 10-point action plan that the government published last year, you know, it's an excellent plan. It covers all the right bases. But as I see it, we could go further in that with Manchester. You know, for example, what do I mean? It's all very well looking at that as Mike says, retrofit, capital infrastructure investments, infrastructure development, property development, etc. But has Manchester and the UK generally, and the North specifically, got the right skills to deliver that? And I mean, on the appraisal of green investments from the private sector side as well as the public sector. You know, I'll give you another example. As you know, as a colleague in Mott MacDonald, I've been working extensively on the Tees Valley hydrogen hub for transport decarbonisation. You know, a major international project, or a project of international significance. But the big question mark there is, if we made this investment and we spent all that capital and produced a hydrogen electrolyser to support transport to go greener, have we actually got the skills in the North, and all the way from apprentices to mid-level to higher level skills, to actually do that? So unless we do that parallel investment in infrastructure and in soft skills, people, enterprise, etc., we will miss the opportunity from these investment funds.
That is a fantastic point, because it's just not about the money. It's also about all of the skills in the common labour market that I've heard you talk about often enough. Anna Jane, if I go to you from an industry perspective, how ready do you think we are to meet some of these challenges in the North, and what is it that you'd say we need to do now?
I think we've got a long way to go, and actually in this question I would not draw on my rail experience, but I'll tell you a couple of little stories about property actually from my own personal experience recently. I'm having a big renovation project undertaken domestically in Liverpool actually, and you mentioned retrofit, and I would love to do our whole Victorian house renovation with sustainability, and you know, it's a long-term project. I'd love it to be a green project, but honestly, is it? It isn't, and I think that's partly because of a lack of incentives, but it's also what Paul was saying there about skills. The lads that are doing my project are not skilled on green you know, ways of heating a house that's Victorian, for example. That's not the way they've been trained, and it's not the way they've not adapted yet. So it's been really hard for us to try and build that in. And so if I'm of the generation that I want to, and I've got the money to, but I can't access it, we need to think about that. And the second example is a colleague of mine's buying a new build house at the moment. It's not built yet. It's actually in Yorkshire rather than in the Northwest. And I asked him the other day, so if you've got a ground source heat pump, you know, what's your house being heated by? Because, you know, surely something new and whizzy, is it? And he says, nah, can't be boiler. And I thought, if you can't have it on a new build, you know, if they can't justify it either, again, as I say, the incentive isn't there for the builder, and or is it that you can't get the skills to do it in volume enough to, you know, and there's a circle there, isn't there? Well, we've got no chance, have we? Never mind retrofit. If we can't even construct houses with the technology built in from the start, then, you know, we're really up against it, aren't we? So I do think we need to invest in those skills, because you need mass available skills of those types to make it worthwhile, you know, for the big house builders, for the big engineering companies in the railway to be delivering those new technologies. There needs to not just be a few people who are specialists who know how to do it. We need volume to make the step change? And I can see Mike's nodding. Hopefully that chimes with what you understand about where we need to go.
Mike, if we go to you, because this is something which is squarely in your playground. What do you think?
Absolutely, and really good points by Paul and Anna Jane there. What's really important for supply chains, SMEs, to invest in growing those skills, because skills, yes, there's a role for colleges and schools and that sort of thing, but actually it's getting the SME to get the supply chain people who want to invest in the skills and the training, the equipment to deliver into these markets. What do they need? First and foremost, they need long-term commitment. They need to know this is a market that they are going to be able to go for long-term. So we can't have the Grow Green project the government launched last year has sort of collapsed after a year, hasn't provided that long-term certainty to allow businesses and plumbers to invest in actually, how do I know about heat pumps rather than about boilers? So we need long-term commitment tightening standards. One thing we're doing in Manchester is we are looking at actually accelerating the point where all buildings in Manchester need to be zero carbon. The sort of City Council have agreed in principle, they're going to start looking for 2023, the next local plan, to have all new homes need to be zero carbon. If you get that standard, that means it's not just the best in the market who are delivering that. That brings everyone up to the same point where the supply chain can start to say, I need to be able to deliver into that because I've got a long-term commitment to that, what that's going to be. Now, the great point, I think, for Manchester is if we can do that, and you talked before about being world leading, and I think up there in among the best, I think world leading is quite a dangerous place to be, but sort of one back from the cutting edge is where I think we want to be. That means we can grow our skills locally before everyone else. And as the rest of the UK starts to have new build standards, then we've got the supply chain, we've got the businesses who know how to deliver it and can then start to grow those skills across the rest of the UK. So we can't do zero carbon as a hair shirt thing. It's got to be people seeing opportunities for growth and success in that way. And if we just do that little bit of leadership, grow our SMEs so they can supply into that, that seems the best route forward to actually deliver the zero carbon world we want to create. You've gone on to mute.
Sorry, there's a question from John Jones on here. Now, we've already talked about the kind of projects that could be started as part of the levelling agenda in terms of the projects that we could start now. Are there any other further examples over and above the domestic refurbishments that we've talked about that we believe are shovel ready and can be actually started? Given that property and interest of the projects.
Can I pick two?
Yes, sure.
First one I'm going to pick up is, and I'm not allowed to use these in the same phrase now, walking initiatives and cycling initiatives, making our streets good for walking. It doesn't require any great technology. It requires things. In our office today, I've cycled in. I've gone down one of those temporary traffic lanes on the A56 cycling. That's what's encouraged me to come in on my bike. There are some simple things we can do about getting a better walking environment and a better cycling environment. The second one I'm going to pick is solar PV. I was talking to a business owner in Ardwick this morning, 6,000 square foot factory, has got a loan from HSBC to put solar panels on the roof. We should be having half of the roofs in Greater Manchester with solar panels on it. That's probably the best thing we can do to create low carbon electricity in our city. We need to get the financing system, supply chain in place so we can deliver on that.
Thank you. I'll take the conversation slightly in a different direction now. To Paul, in your slide pack, you mentioned a thing about if we were really leveling up, we would, if I get it right, need somewhere around circa 72 billion versus the 4.8 billion that we're currently seeing. Now, where do you think this gap is going to come from? Or what's the role of the private sector in it? And if you go further into it, what does Manchester really need to do?
It's probably the most difficult question you could have asked me, Saurabh. I would suggest back to that collaboration, because I think Mike's outlined a lovely social outcomes vision there. We call it social and distributional impact analysis when we do the appraisal. Of course, I think it's probably a fantasy that the government's going to find an extra £72 billion to as one of the measures. Having said that, unless we change our focus as public sector and the way we appraise things, unless the private sector takes a slightly longer term view of its investments and is a bit more patient in terms of its capital returns, etc., we're going to be stuck in the same malaise. You know, my opinion is that we need to focus a lot more, as Mike's already said, on those outcomes, the purpose, that rationale in that Rome F I put up there. You know, why are we doing these things? If you go back and look at the King and Kay book on uncertainty that I mentioned, the key question in that book, the sort of the common theme is, why are we doing this? Yes, we live in a social market economy, and I'm very supportive. I'm sat in my nice South Warrington home, etc. I'm interested in making money for me and my family and our future prosperity. But we also need to think on about what is the purpose of me going to work from McDonald every single day. And our purpose is very clear: to be commercial, to develop our employees, to support our staff and our supply chain, but also trying to make the world a better place. Now, that sounds very grandiose, I know, but if you boil that down to social outcomes, small business employing 10 people, that's a really important contribution. If you boil that down to trying to do the right thing and not look for the quick fix all the time, and green might be a thing that's been around for a long time, but we have agency now. It's really, really important that we all see that bigger picture on climate change. So how green, as our speakers have already said, is the current new build program? How can we personally make it greener? What would I spend another £200 to get that heat pump put in, etc., etc.? We all have our personal and professional integrity, and I think it's important that we live and breathe those values.
Thank you. And are you seeing, Paul, in the business cases that you're getting involved in on working with the various funds, that the private sector is starting to get an appetite to participate in this, given that PPP at one point of time was becoming pretty much persona non grata here? So is that going to restart? Do you think that's important?
I think, as I've already said, sort of the new bank over in Leeds is a huge step forward in terms of bringing that sort of logical thinking, maybe a bit more patient to return on investments around levelling up and around the green agenda in particular. It is a great time. As I said earlier, I'm going to put some challenges in these slides, but I think it's actually a great time to be involved in our industry with Pro Manchester, looking to the future with confidence. There is an acceleration in the COVID era of some of the things we saw happening anyway. Decarbonisation front and centre of that, transport travel patterns, Mike cycling into work, etc. How we interact in offices, how the leisure sector recovers. We spent the last 12 months saying to people, keep 2 meters apart. But in about 2 months' time, you're going to be saying to me, can you get the bus or the train into Manchester to the office? And we need to realise that there are some big challenges we've got as a society, and respect each other in that regard. Now, I'm giving lots of soft fluff to a really hard, property infrastructure development audience, but I do believe that our value system as society is moving in that direction. And I'm very proud to be associated with our social outcomes and company purpose at McDonald. And again, to reiterate, notwithstanding, our first purpose is to our employees and our shareholders to keep their investments and their jobs safe. Second purpose is to look at technology, to look at social outcomes in all our schemes. And for me, in terms of investment, that boils down to that rationale question. Why are we making this investment? Yes, return on investment to make money, etc., and be commercial. But there's an opportunity if we all do the right thing in Manchester to make a huge difference. Take the risk and employ one more apprentice. Take the risk and make that little investment in solar panels for the office or the house or whatever. Just those little tiny steps take us on the way to that £72 billion extra. It's not going to come from the centre.
Anna Jane, you have a lot of views in the transportation industry. Do you think the industry people that you work with are looking at, say, the transportation sector slightly differently and participating a bit more than we currently are able to, in terms of the monetary and the infrastructure development side of it?
So I think the challenges are similar for us in the the transport sector and rail specifically post-COVID, we really do need to think about the rationale, as Paul calls it. So what is the railway for, and who is the railway for? And that the answer to that might be different post-COVID, or the balance of who it's for might be different post-COVID. And given what we've said about, finances being limited, and they are, what are we going to choose to spend those limited finances on? What are we going to choose to prioritize them on? So for instance, do we want a railway that's delivering more for freight because we want to skew it more towards reducing carbon emissions? We could do that if we chose to do that as a policy decision. Do we want it to be about a leisure market more than a commuter market? Maybe it necessarily will be for a period of time in the immediate post-COVID era. So what does that look like? We've focused really heavily on commuter markets for the past number of years. Is that right anymore? Or do we need to say, actually, the only way to make the railway survive is to say it's about leisure markets for a while? These are really key decisions, and it isn't a finite pot. It is a finite pot of money. So there's some hard decisions in there, but we need to take those decisions. Otherwise we won't have a railway. It's as simple as that. We won't have a railway to run if we don't face some of those really difficult decisions head on. So I'm hoping that's what we're going to see in the next coming months as we emerge from this, and as we approach some structural reform, which should make some of those things easier, I hope.
I think, as we already said, Anna Jane, the COVID has accentuated trends that were already happening. And before the pandemic, what you've outlined already, the growth in trips on the railway and generally in travel was coming from the leisure sector.
Can I chip one more thing about the decision making very briefly? Agree with Paul's point about Green Book and Green Book reform, very much welcome. What we mustn't do is throw away the idea of there being a financial and commercial appraisal of the sorts of decisions Anna Jane was talking about. And I think the risk we're seeing in the last year is some of the sort of Green Book reform turning into no Green Book, let's just make an arbitrary decision. And Paul picked up some of those decisions that have come out the last year. So we've got to be making the case for a proper appraisal system, a better appraisal system doing that. The other point I want to make briefly is about local decision making. We've got some great governance structures in the north. We need to use them. They need to be empowered to help make some of those decisions. So a lot of decisions Anna Jane were making are not decisions that are best made in London. They're decisions best made across the north, and we should have the powers and the capacity to make those decisions and implement them.
So Rab, if I might respond to Mark's 2 points. I'm challenging the Green Book, but actually I think it's an absolutely fantastic system of decision making. I've picked it to pieces with better economists than me. When you ask what's the alternative, you generally find that this is possibly as good as it gets. I think the second point on devolution, Mike, you're absolutely right. There's a thin end of the wedge potentially. I mean, we've got a new growth deal for a new mayor in Leeds, for example, as one end. But at the other end, in levelling up, you've also got local MPs, representatives of the national government, if you like, involved in the decision-making process for local funds for levelling up. And I think that conflates that issue of, is it devolved or isn't it?
Well, thank you. I think we could actually carry on debating this topic. But as with anything, I think we have run out of time now, and we would be joining back again at 10. I think it's been an interesting debate, but I think takeaways for us is it's not that bad, and the economy will actually keep on carrying on. But if we need to actually make some of these investments, we need to think about long-term strategy, and all parties, both public and private, need to participate and look at some novel ideas that Mike and Anna and Paul have actually presented, and maybe get on with acting on them. So thank you very much for the panel. We'll be back here at 1:10. And thank you. Adam, over to yourself.
Thanks, everybody. Yeah, back in 10 minutes. Go grab a coffee. We'll see you then. Thank you. Okay, welcome back everyone. I hope you're all suitably refreshed. We've got some great speakers and panelists coming up next. We're going to hear first from Jessica Bowles, Director of Strategy for Bruntwood, on her reflections on business and property in a COVID world, followed by a panel discussing rebalancing the regions. How can the built environment drive prosperity? And that will be chaired by Suzanne Benson from Trowers and Hamlins and co-chair of the property group, Steve Gillingham from Ryder Levitt Bucknell, and Steve Dobson from Overbury. So just to introduce Jessica, Jessica spent 15 years in Whitehall before moving to Manchester City Council as head of the city policy, supporting work on devolution, the Northern Powerhouse, and leading the development of the 10-year Our Manchester strategy, which was developed with partners from across Manchester. She joined Bruntwood in 2016, helping to support the company's ambitions for long-term growth, in particular creating new innovation districts and strengthening connections to our cities and communities. As Director of Strategy and member of the Bruntwood Group Board, her focus is particularly on the business's external relationships and opportunities for creating thriving cities. So I will now pass over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Adam. And I started there on mute, which is not a good start, is it? How many of us are still managing that nearly a year into lockdown? So I think this is a really, well, I was given this title about talking about business and property in a COVID world, and goodness, where do you start? It's such a big topic. So when I was thinking about today, my thought was actually, this feels like a moment to look forward and really to look at some of the opportunity that exists and how we can manage our way through the next 6, 12 months and those years beyond. I thought I could talk about that sort of reopening phase that we're going to need to have of the economy and how we can make that work in a place, from a place perspective in Manchester, but with lessons, I think, for many other cities, and then also touch on the recovery longer term. And I know you've got a panel coming next, which is going to be looking at the levelling up agenda, and I'm sure we'll touch on some of these issues too, but perhaps I can seed some thoughts into that if I may before that starts. But first, I thought if I step back and think about cities and what happened to them through COVID, I think it goes without saying that cities and city centres in particular have been really hit badly. And when you look at what has happened through the mass working from home, the closure of leisure, hospitality facilities, and the closure of our borders to international visitors, you can see why city centres, which rely on all those things, have been particularly badly damaged. And we've been doing some work through a business group that Chris Oglesby and I are involved in, United City, which we'll touch on a bit more later, at some of the evidence behind this and some of the Zoom shock, as it's called. And when you map what's happened to particular parts of the city at micro level, you can see some of the very big impacts that will have been had on city centres. But also their recovery is totally essential to the future success, not just of Manchester, but of Greater Manchester, and I'd argue the North as a whole. City centres are ecosystems. We need to think about them not as a series of sectors that all need their own to reopen, but the way that a city centre works together as an ecosystem with people who work in offices, with people who are visiting from overseas, with people who are coming in using leisure facilities, with our students and the like. These things all play together and are what drives the economy of a city centre. And you can kind of say, okay, well, so what about a city centre? Does that matter to the rest of the city region? And we've got flourishing district centres in some of our across the city region. So does this really matter when they've benefited, when those town centres and high streets have benefited through this COVID period and people not coming into the city centre? And I would argue that absolutely yes. And the economic fundamentals of agglomeration argue for strong, dense cores of cities, and the way that generates value across the city region. And you can just see from Manchester's success over the last couple of decades, the role that the city centre has played in generating, in being an engine of the economy and generating output and productivity within the city region, and acting as a magnet for talent, both talent that exists within Manchester to stay, but also talent to come from outside Manchester to locate here, to live, work and build our lives, and that relies on that successful city centre. So I kind of think the argument around cities and their need for recovery is one that I absolutely see is made, and I found last summer the arguments around, is the city dead? Is this the death of the city? I railed against those, not just from a economic perspective or from a policy perspective, but also from a human perspective. You can see the value of people coming together, being stimulated by new ideas, by the melting pot that cities can become. And apologies if anyone's ever heard me say this before, but the last holiday I had before COVID struck was to Italy, and I went to Pompeii and saw that city from 2000 years ago, and how it functioned as a place that was a gathering place, that was a place of creativity, that was a place where people hung out for leisure, where they bought things, where they traded ideas and goods, and lived and created and generated. And actually cities through the millennia continue to do that, and continue to hold that role in society and in creating a space for people to come together and for communities to flourish. So I think I just want to, I'll pivot now onto through the next few months. Government's clearly set out its roadmap with a series of milestone dates, which may shift, but give, at least for the first time, I think, a real sense of the other side. And I'm really delighted that we now have this, and we have it in a way that is making the case for a single a single journey out of lockdown, rather than us moving in and out of restrictions, of us moving at different paces in different places. I think that's really critical. But I also think that we need to be able to grasp this in particular places, so that we can see how to make this roadmap really work effectively and within an ecosystem. So I mentioned earlier United City. This is a research-backed business group that Chris Oglesby, my chief executive, Gary Neville, Frank McKenna, Lisa Morton and Will Lewis came together to create early in the pandemic, with the aim of supporting a safe recovery for Manchester. And United City have put together a manifesto, which you can see on the United City website, which starts talking about the fact that we need business, the public sector and local public sector and national government to work together to make the roadmap be effective and allow us to come out of the other side of these measures. And I think that the key things I just want to touch on now, one is about vaccination and the vaccination story, and the second is about how we move through reopening. So in relation to vaccination, Manchester's actually made great progress, and we're slightly ahead of where the national average is in terms of vaccination numbers. We're going to be through the first 8 groups in a few weeks, and then be able to move into the 18 to 49-year-old age group. I was astonished yesterday to hear that 30% of that age group have already been vaccinated, by the fact that they're either health and social care workers or in the clinically vulnerable groups. So we're already making good progress and inroads into that group. We obviously need to watch for cold spots and areas where we've got low levels of vaccination, and the local authorities are working with public health teams and local communities to identify those and take clinics out into communities to really try and deal with that potential issue that we would have, which could create flare-ups in the future. And then if we look to the sort of wider reopening, we can see the dates for hospitality and for people to start coming back into the city, but it's very notable that the work from home, if you can, guidance stands until the 21st of June. And we're arguing that that's too blunt an instrument, and that it has a pretty damaging impact both on individuals, businesses and the city as a whole to wait that long before the guidance gets relaxed by government. We think that there's a really strong case for a phased reopening of a phased relaxation of the guidance from government, so that we can begin to come back to the workplace in a phased way, in a secure way, and in a way that supports the city as a whole. So if you think about the value, you know, we talked a lot last summer about not just cities being dead, but offices being dead. But I'm seeing a real sort of shift in this first quarter of this year, with both individuals and businesses really recognising that this can't go on. This permanent working from home 5 days a week is just not effective over the long term. There's a real value to individuals in terms of their well-being and mental health issues. Within our business, we have quite a number of young people in particular who are using the office on a regular basis because it's just not tenable for them to work from home. There are inequity issues about having to work from home if you don't have the right setup, if you live in overcrowded circumstances, or if you suffer from a series of mental health issues. We're also seeing physical health starting to decline with people working from home in setups that aren't suitable for it. In terms of businesses, the value of being able to collaborate and create together is really something that we're hearing more and more from our customer base and other businesses across the city, where working from home, you can do it, and there are clearly some activities you can do perfectly well from home, and events like this are, you know, possible. But that there is a value in being able to do some things face to face and being able to spark off each other, innovate, create, and build a culture within a business. And then clearly there's this value to the city as a whole. People can come back to the city to use our amenities and our leisure facilities, but there is a real question about whether that's enough footfall to allow businesses to trade their way out of this issue, rather than having to be on business on government support for a far longer period of time. If we could increase the footfall in a safe way as we bring people back into the workplace, into the office-based workplace, we should start being able to help support more businesses through this period. And we think there are safe ways to do this. You can create COVID secure environments with social distancing in your workplace. We managed to get up to 65% capacity in the autumn period. And actually, as soon as we did do that, people were flooding back to our offices and were wanting to, we were having to turn people away because we didn't have quite enough seats. But that creation of good quality space that is COVID secure is possible. We also think there's a role for testing and workplace testing. Within Bruntwood, we're going to be providing lateral flow tests. These can now be done for a matter of £6-7 a person for good quality lateral flow tests, with a regime around that, which means that for positive tests, people then can go and get PCR testing. And government and local government and Manchester City Council in particular have set up some asymptomatic test sites for key workers, one of which is in the town hall. And they're looking to roll those out so that city centre workers more widely can use them, where businesses can't set up their own testing regimes, some of which is backed by the government too. And I think the final part of how we make this a safe reopening is around local track and trace. So we all know the stories of track and trace, and my view, the unmitigated disaster of the national system that was set up. But local government is now looking to take control of the track and trace system, and central government is looking to pass that across to local government so that they can have a much closer understanding of the communities that they're working with, and also understand the locations of outbreaks and how that can work. And some of the pilot work that's been done on local track and trace is very positive. And I think that's another role where business can play its part, supplementing or adding to local track and trace by having its own good quality data about who's using their facilities, who's around, and where people are testing positive should they do so. So I think there's a package of things that can help us move through that, and I expect United City to start making the case for government to relax the guidance for a phased return to the workplace before the 21st of June, all being well and subject to the data going in the right direction for both vaccination and testing. And then if I may, just a couple of points about recovery as we look ahead, and I hope Suzanne will pick some of these up in her panel. But clearly we need to think about the fabric of the city centre and how we support outdoor venues, how we continue to make it a really welcoming, great environment to spend time in and dwell in and come to as a visitor. So I think that's goes without saying. I think there also needs to be a continued investment in infrastructure. We need to continue to make that case to government. This isn't all about left behind towns. This is about cities as well. And we need to continue to support that alongside an opportunity that we really have right now to invest much more heavily in R&D and science and innovation. Government wants to increase spending in this area, and what we need to be doing is making the case for that to be place-based, to be devolved to cities and to areas outside the Golden Triangle, so that we can use innovation to drive our economy over the coming 5, 10, 15 years. And then finally, skills, and particularly those for young people, where I think government needs to work with local government and business to really think about how we tackle the skills issues that exist, that have always existed, but also layered on that some of the problems that we've seen raised through COVID, where young people are coming out into a damaged labour market with very damaged education over the last period of time. So I'm going to leave it there with some thoughts that bleed into the panel, and hand across to Suzanne Benson from Trowse and Hammond. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Jessica. I think I'm on now. Welcome everyone to the last session of the afternoon. We are a slightly bijou panel today. I'm hoping I've got both my panel members on. We were due to be joined by Robert Goodall from Together Money, who unfortunately is unwell today. So it would appear that you have to be called Steve to be on our panel this afternoon. So I'm really delighted to be joined today by Steve Dobson, who is a workplace consultant with Overbury. Obviously, how our workplace is going to look in the future is a really hot topic at the moment. And secondly, Steve Gillingham, this is going to be a challenge, isn't it, when I'm directing my questions, who has the intriguing job title of Head of National Commissions, and he's with Ryder Levett Bucknell. So when we thought about how we might run the session today, we decided to provide a bit of framework. We'd set our discussions around a report that we've recently issued. Oh, well done, Prime Minister. At Trowse, which is focusing on the inclusive growth of cities. So for the past 18 months, we've been running a campaign looking at the drivers of prosperity and growth in our cities and our urban centres, And as part of that, we brought together over 160 people and conducted two YouGov polls, one in the summer of 2019, and then because of everything that happened last year, we thought it'd be a good idea to rerun it over last summer, just to see how people's views had changed. And we focused on the 4 cities we operate in, so Manchester, Exeter, Birmingham and London. And underpinning that was looking at the role of real estate in providing a platform for how society functions and how it might thrive in the future. And I think one of the consequences coming out of the last 12 months has been that notable acceleration in the conversations we're having around things like climate change and social value. And I think that really just increases the importance of understanding how the built environment we live in contributes to people's perceptions of how they can operate the future of their cities. And also we've heard quite a lot today about how people might move back into those urban centres as they start to return to work, we start to return to some level of normality. So we launched the report a couple of weeks ago. And before I bring in the panellists, I thought it might be useful just to flag some of the Manchester specific, can't speak today, statistics which came out through the 2 YouGov polls we did. So just starting on people's general view of the future, how they think their cities are going to operate in the future, and possibly as a direct consequence of the additional restrictions we've been operating under in Greater Manchester. There was a marked difference between Manchester and the other 3 cities in terms of how optimistic they felt about future recovery and the speed of that recovery. Interestingly, the most resoundingly positive of the 4 was Birmingham in every question. But I think there was quite a difference, particularly in the Manchester responses. Manchester was also least positive about the role they saw their national government playing in terms of future growth, although interestingly they were very positive about local leadership, which I think is very positive for the elections we've got coming up in the next couple of months. And it is interesting that the poll we ran last summer was ahead of some of the disagreements in September around the local lockdowns. I think the response may have changed even further after that. All of the 4 cities saw a marked emphasis on access to arts and culture being increasingly important to people, and we will pick that up as part of the discussion. And Manchester, in both of the polls we did, strongly identified in terms of their cultural roots and how important they saw that to the city. On the housing side, across all the areas we polled, I think there was a shift away from focusing on quality, interestingly, and also price, towards more of an emphasis on space. Although, slightly surprisingly, Manchester was probably the city that showed the least emphasis on the importance of increased space. The Manchester respondents were also the least positive about how they felt there was future potential for growth in house prices, which again I think is possibly reflective of some of the affordability questions that have been raised, particularly in the last 12 months. In both polls, across the board for the Manchester respondents, they consistently ranked the importance of access to transport, to education, to arts and culture more highly than the other 3 cities. There's a slight drop in all the cities around education over the past 12 months, which again might surprise you considering how much we've all enjoyed homeschooling. But it was clearly those things that bring people together were identified as important. And there's also a small drop in confidence shown in terms of how people viewed the future of the city in terms of wanting to live there, which again may be reflective of the mood at the time. But I think what were really good signs were people felt that the city had a really strong future in terms of increased sustainability, and also the mood strongly came back that the city seemed to be somewhere that would be more socially inclusive in the future. So again, I think those are really positive on a number of levels. So let's try and put that in a bit of context with our panel. So Steve, you've got quite different day jobs. So what are you seeing at the moment in the sectors you work in as you're starting to look forward to the next 12 months? So Steve Gillingham, you're next to me on the virtual table, so I'll hand over to you.
Okay, so I think well, I'll check that you can hear me okay, first of all. Yeah, good. I think this has been a tale of two extremes over the last year. You've got anxious people and people who appear to be completely unconcerned. You've got overworked people, and then you've got people on furlough. You've got vaxxers and anti-vaxxers, and people who seem to be thriving, and people who are genuinely suffering. And most of those I hear talking about this seem to be in the thrive group, but that may be something to do with the stage in life, I don't know. I think we just need to check in constantly that we're covering all the groups. The reality for some, that Jessica picked up actually, for some sharers, for some shielders, for some grievers, has been actually very, very difficult over the past year. But I picked up on three sort of themes, Suzanne, which were unprecedented uncertainty at this stage. So we still don't know what will happen, and we've got a timescale for unlocking, but you know, everybody wants that to be beaten. So the timescales are not clear. When will it all be over, and what does that even look like in a future, and what will the impact be on our new normal? And of course, unprecedented uncertainty is not great for property investments, which typically shies away from uncertainty and looks for a level of certainty, including foreign investments. The second theme was that I feel like it's obvious to say it, but solutions have to be founded on flexibility going forward. David Solomon from Goldman Sachs, I believe, is completely wrong about working from home being an aberration forever. I think we have to accept the home office hybrid and then accept the continued flexible needs of workforces and work out how we deal with that from a town and city perspective and a built environment perspective. And the third theme, I don't want to be too negative, but I won't be later on, but I don't think we've seen the bottom of this yet. I think sadly the end of furlough will lead to multiple job losses that will, as always, be disproportionately impacting the North. And the reality of that is yet to be felt. So I think the recovery is going to be staged.
Thank you. Steve Dobson, this sounds very formal.
I know, yeah. Afternoon all. I think there's a slight crossover between everything that's coming out of the panel, the conversations previously, and that Steve just brought up there. Certainly, when we're looking at an interior market or refurbishment, uncertainty is undoubtedly one of the key topics at the moment. People want to know what we're going to need to provide when we get back to whatever kind of normal and what normal is going to look like. So that's obviously a key theme. Businesses trying to understand their needs. There's also a real shift we're seeing where previously there was a focus on space and efficiency and driving that efficiency to be effective. We're now beginning to see a bit of a switch to a more people-centric view on the built environment and actually look at people as individuals. I think this what we're going through at the moment, this enforced pilot, if you like, of working from home, has seen huge advances in the uptake in technology. I think it was the CEO of Microsoft who said, you know, they reckon they've seen 2 years worth of digital transformation happen in the first sort of 3 months of this. That's only progressed. We've now stumbled across a digital workplace, which we've now got to marry with a physical workplace. But there's a huge view on understanding our people. What is it we actually really, really need? And with that, there's a real focus. And there has been, over the past sort of 2 years, I would say, there's been a slight shift towards well-being. So the sort of third trend that we're seeing is a real focus on well-being. Not only we do need to provide the right environment for our people, our individuals, as we're now understanding they are, to succeed and thrive and be productive. We're also looking at it from a well-being point of view. And I think that brings big challenges, perhaps more into Steve's environment that we'll talk on later, because the pressure on that built environment, certainly from commercial sector, looking at landlords, you're faced with tenants that want shorter flexible leases, but also provide, everyone is now aware in terms of what air quality and air rates mean in their buildings. Our clients are now focused and aware of that, and that adds pressure up the line to that duty of care in terms of well-being to our staff. So I think it's those three things: uncertainty without a question of a doubt. That's everywhere. It's one of the key themes everywhere. But definitely a people-centric focus on spaces that were now being provided, with a real shift and a real in-depth look at well-being, not just sort of, I think 2 years ago, you could say people knew the phrase, but were pandering to it. Now there's a real focus on actually delivering on what that actually means.
Thank you both. Well, I think Steve, with you, Steve Dobson, with you on the call, I don't think it would help but start to focus a bit more on the buildings, particularly the buildings we work in, and how we see them adapting as uses change, as demands change, and as we start to return to the office. How do you see that progressing?
Okay, how long have we got? You might have to just give me a flag if I'm going on too long.
There's only two of you, go on.
Obviously, we're beginning to see huge change, and I think I'm going back to Paul Hammond's point in the initial presentation, which I thought it's not my area, but I thought it was great. He touched on there that what we're going through is evolution. It's not revolution, and that's the same for the built office interior market. We were always on a journey to provide a productive place where people can work efficiently, effectively, and be at their best. That is a continuation. We've just had that process accelerated by the pandemic. So we've got this, what we're calling hybrid working, the working from home, the working in the office. And there's a couple of trains of thought. Essentially, working from home is here to stay. We've opened Pandora's box to employees who have benefited, or the majority, as Steve rightly says, some haven't, but the majority have benefited from the lack of commuting, saving money because of not going into city centres. Work-life balance is better. Being with family more, that is now ingrained into the way we're working, and people aren't going to give that up too easily. We've seen the benefits of it. But there is, while that novelty is now beginning to wear off, people are understanding that actually we do need to get back to a built office environment. We need that social connection. I think Steve was right, and he may well mention the younger demographic of society has been the one that have struggled the most during this in terms of the data that we're seeing. Those that are in city locations that are flat sharing, house sharing, struggling to fight over the Wi-Fi connection or get to the space to work during the day. That's been a real challenge. There's a definite need for those to get back to the office, not only from a social point of view, but also from a knowledge sharing and education point of view, learning from colleagues, mentoring and graduate schemes. Those of you who've got graduate schemes will know exactly what I'm talking about. We have a large graduate scheme and have found that exact problem with ourselves. Our graduates desperate to get back into the office to sort of continue their learning and development, so to speak. But in essence, the office, it's not dead, as some may have claimed, far from it. We're looking, or data is telling us that we knew that one-to-one desk ratios were never an efficient way of using space anyway. We're always going less. We're looking at that people, it's going to be sort of 5-to-10 ratio. So we're looking at 1-to-2 ratio, sorry. So half the week in, half the week out, 2 or 3 days in, 2 or 3 days out. And when people are in the office, it's going to be focused around collaboration topics. We're going to the office because we want to or we need to. It's a destination to attract people to get something done. So these are going to be spaces where people can be creative, innovation, we collaborate, we bounce ideas off each other. We go there, we get motivated, we get energized by our company, by our culture. And then if we go, and then we've got the option of working at home when we need to get our head down and focus. And proofread and do all the concentration type tasks. Now, that's not to say that the office is going to have no concentration task. I think open plan has been great for certain elements, but there's always been a lack of focus space within offices. So we're going to see those becoming a real sort of hubs for collaboration, people getting together and doing what we like doing when we're in the office, talking to each other face to face. Clearly, technology is going to be a part of that, and we're going to have to integrate technology into the meeting and collaboration spaces to enable 3 or 4 people in the office to have this kind of conversation with 3 or 4 people outside of the office. There's no office that does that well at the moment, as well as providing, focus spaces. So I'll wrap this up by saying at the moment there are kind of two kind of trends that we're seeing in the market, if you like. Those that have got a lease event in the next 12 months are predominantly looking at consolidation of space. And that's not necessarily meaning less spend on the office. It may just be consolidation of space, but take that space in a slightly better area or with better facilities for their people. Those that have got a lease event that is beyond 12 months or don't have a lease event in a sort of short term, it's more about repurposing space. So we're going to take some of these work settings that we don't use out, and what can we provide to attract people back to the office and provide the right environment that when they are in, they get everything they need. So hopefully I've made that as brief as I can.
That was fascinating. Thank you. I think a lot of people on the call, myself included, are waiting with bated breath to see what happens with our offices. I think if I get my entire office back in, we don't have enough desks now. So I think
that will be the norm. People were already working in an agile way. It's just the office didn't support it. We are creatures of habit. We get accustomed to our space. And now we've got the chance to the office has got the chance to catch up a little bit. So for a lot of clients that we're talking to and things we're talking about, it's an opportunity to now get your office right to support how your people are now working and the technology you're now using.
Yeah, it's really exciting. So Steve, giving you, this isn't going to make me laugh the whole time, but it probably will. In the wider projects you're involved in, how are you seeing this impacting? And I know Steve also touched on the question of repurposing some of our existing spaces. Are you seeing that being discussed as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think I'm going to pick up on this point of this being an ecosystem, again, that Jessica shared before, that is evolving. And some of it's changing a lot faster at the moment, and some of it's not changing very much. The drivers are still there. So yes, offices are changing because of the live-work dynamic. Yes, retail was changing, and it was already, frankly. The flight from the high street was well underway, and the flight to distribution centres to support online has just been accelerated. Infrastructure was already changing, a renewed focus on effective mass transit, alternative to cars. But there's also stuff that really isn't changing and still needs a lot of investment. Modernisation of our education estates continues. I mean, arguably, there might be a bit of a shift. The FE market has not had much focus over the last 10 years or so, and yet it's probably one of the areas that could support the apprenticeship offers going forward. So maybe there's something a bit more there. There's still an undersupply of affordable housing across the whole of the country, and particularly in certain areas in Greater Manchester. And that may continue this push towards local authorities for actually providing local authority housing again. We've still got an ageing population, nothing's changed there. So mixed mode, older living and extra care needs are still required. And our healthcare provision, whilst there are new models of provision, particularly in this region where it's being devolved, the basic parameters haven't changed. There's still, if anything, they've just been underlined by COVID, the problems of underinvestment in our health service over the past few years. So that modernisation needs to continue. So I think there's definitely areas where sectors that are just need continued focus, frankly, going forward. In terms of repurposing those spaces to add value, I think we just need to think about those things that were already happening, the footfall that was changing, the mixed mode home working, which is changing even more, the move to online retail, and something Steve picked up on, which is more of a focus around social value and sustainability. And then think about how this affects our town centres and our city centres. People will be attracted to a 15-minute commute to do some of their working, perhaps, but that doesn't necessarily get you that sort of vibrant highlight of the week in the city. It doesn't necessarily get you the collaborative spaces where we all meet, the learning, the training, the fully engaged spaces. So those spaces do need to be repurposed, and they need to be something that Manchester has done well as a city. Just contextualise, so thinking carefully about what those towns and those cities actually have to offer. What will draw people in and reduce that uncertainty, in the same way that as employers we need to think about how we get people back into the offices to make them purposeful. But at the end of the day, we're social animals, so I'm absolutely confident that people will want to be sharing spaces again. Just might need to take a while before we get to hug each other straight away. It does sort of lend itself towards some of the things that were happening in Manchester anyway, and some of the outlying parts of the Greater Manchester as well, around the informal economy that was thriving, around pop-ups, constantly changing and evolving town centres, you know, listening to customers, users, people on the street about what they actually want in a space. And maybe we get that public realm right, as your report suggests. We really get that public realm right, and then that gives the environment for these flexible uses to thrive and for people to come back into repurposed spaces.
That's great, thank you. I think we'd be remiss, particularly as I know that Mike Wilton is still on the call, if we didn't consider the question of climate change in all of this. Manchester now have their own climate change framework with a zero carbon target set for 2025. There is undoubtedly going to be a challenge to maintain this and simultaneously encourage people back into the city. What role do you see the built environment playing in all of that? What initial changes do you think we need to see? Shall I come to you, Steve Gillingham, first?
Yeah, happy to start on that. I'm not going to claim to be an expert in this area, and Mike will know that. But you know, the well publicised net zero emissions target of 2038 in new developments 2028. I think Liverpool's only 2 years behind on both of them, but you know, that's a good position for Manchester to be in. But actually, there are some things, particularly because new development needs to be taking a big role in that net zero by 2028. There are things that need to change. Local and regional strategic plans need to absolutely prioritise green development, biodiversity, carbon offsetting plans. You know, planning and building control needs the teeth to support these ambitious targets, and there needs to be true leadership from those planning authorities to make sure that, you know, we're held to account collectively as an industry to deliver that. But it also does play into some of what Steve was talking about before, the retrofit strategy that we've got. You know, there's a lot of embodied carbon in the buildings that already exist in Manchester, and reuse and repurpose of those. You know, reducing energy waste from those buildings, so insulating them properly, and then not relying on natural gas heating. There's some basic net zero improvements that we can do. And I think the other thing is we need to be advocates. So we're not just passive passengers on this journey. And I think the next gen coming into our industry have to be thought of as a stakeholder, who currently perhaps have the least access to decision making ultimately. But I believe if we don't advocate and if we don't make these changes and hit these targets, they'll take things into their own hands, and they'll challenge us. So I think we should be ahead of the curve on that. You know, we've all learned that actually being in a naturally pleasant environment, our back gardens, for those of us who are lucky enough to have them over the last year, have been real eye-openers for us as to how they can be. So let's repurpose towns and cities in a way that support that for everyone. In terms of the initial changes, it has to be an infrastructure move first. And I asked a colleague to sort of give me 4 examples, and they came up with ePort, which is a blueprint for clean energy hub around Ellesmere Port. HyNet Northwest, which is the UK's first carbon capture and storage infrastructure project in the UK. Net Zero Northwest, which is going to be the first carbon cluster in the UK, a 4 billion investment plan there. And then Freeport Liverpool has already set out in its aims to be a global beacon for renewables. So I think I agree with Andy Burnham when he says we're uniquely positioned due to natural assets, the 2 key cities, and the political will and the strong alignment to actually be a leader in this area. And as I say, I think that's important for us to take hold of that.
I'll just echo Steve there. Not an expert, not my area of expertise, but I think there's a movement that's already underway. When I talk to our clients, attention and retention of staff, attraction and retention of staff is high on their agenda, and trying to attract people, which is often the harder of the two, difficult now because generations that are coming into the workplace are far more aware about their own social, mental health, well-being, environmental and sustainability. That's high on their agenda, higher than it ever has been. And I think the movement is already underway. Most clients that we talk to now, sustainability, environmental aspects are almost key drivers in any tender that comes out to market now. So we as a group, Morgan Sindall Group, have just committed to go carbon zero by 2030. And I think most clients that we're talking to and working with now, it's zero waste to landfill, repurposing existing furniture, or reusing or repurposing furniture. There's lots of movements already underway to help support what is already, I think, a movement coming to aid that move to carbon zero and that sustainability going forward. So not my area of expertise, but I can see there's a huge wave in that direction that's not going to go away. It's definitely on a trend to only increase that.
Brilliant, thank you both. Well, I had a million questions, but we're doing a very good job of filling our time. So I have a last question for you both before we hand over to Sean. There's a fair few areas we've not touched on here, so feel free to pick any of these up. But what key difference do you both see moving forward as we get going again, as we move back into our cities? So coming first to Steve Gillingham.
Yeah, so I was thinking about what I'd like to see different. There's an awful lot of stuff that needs to fundamentally change, from investment in proper mass transit that's affordable for everybody to use and gets you to the right places. We need to stop having these regional versus national debates about rail infrastructure. High speed 2 might not be the right answer, but high speed 2 was never about passenger network. It was about getting freight across. And if we have a new superport in Liverpool, it's no good if it takes 13 hours to get that freight across the UK, because it's waiting for passenger trains, waiting and deciding for passenger trains to go past it. So high speed 2 was always about getting a freight network and building a modern transport network. And I think modern transport networks are fundamental going forward. The Northwest has always benefited, or certainly in the 16 years I've been here, from strong leadership, and this absolutely needs to continue. We see that there's a need for national strategies. Public health, vaccination, furlough programs have chosen that, but we also need strong regional leadership to direct the recovery. And most people think Andy Burnham's finest hour was on the steps of the Central Library taking on central government, and I'm inclined to agree, but it needs to continue beyond that with GMCE, Richard Leese, Manchester City Council, continuing to be ambitious about targets for net zero, reduction in space requirements, the mass transit, lower car reliance. And we didn't touch on it, but making cities a really exciting place to be, from an arts and culture and vibrancy and sport and all the reasons you want to be in a city in the first place.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would pick up on Steve's last point there. To be honest, I think we touched on the built environment being all around people and being people centric. I think office city centres have got to provide what people want, and all of the things Steve talked about there are what people want. They want the areas to socialise, to get together, and to have a good time. The working environment in terms of office space needs to accommodate that flexibility, but yeah, the attraction to city centres is all the exciting fun stuff that goes around work. There's lots of benefits when people are moving to a city centre. They move to a city centre because of the facilities, the entertainment around that. So that's not going to change. If anything, it'll be an increase in that. We want to attract people back. It's giving them what they want when they go in there. So yeah, I'd agree with Steve on that last point.
Thank you very much, both, and a very positive note to end on. I'm now going to hand over to Sean.
Hi, Suzanne. Can you hear me? Can you hear me and see me? got the Zoom working. Great stuff. Well, thank you, Suzanne, for the opportunity just to sum up on today's event. Certainly at Together Money, we're delighted to be representing the discussion today and the debate as headline sponsors. And apologies once again that Rob let us down at short notice through unfortunate turn of events. But I just wanted to say thank you to all the speakers and to the panelists, and a big thank you and a sincere recognition for Adam and Suzanne for the sterling part that you both play in representing the sector as leads, and for the sterling work that you do in championing the cause across this city of ours. So for me, some really great takeouts. In the interest of time, I'm not going to labour, but I think it was a really stimulating discussion and debate, some really interesting takeouts. Some really good food for thought as well, as we consider the parts that we all play in terms of building back. I think, again, we talked a lot about the city and the opportunity that presents to us, but we shouldn't lose sight of the wider towns that make up the region as well, and the part that we can play in terms of regenerating and renewal and repurposing our buildings and the fabric of our economies, etc. So I wanted to say a particular thanks to Jessica. I thought it was really insightful, and certainly encouraged me to go away and find a little bit more around the United City agenda. Certainly from my point of view, with some of the things that we're doing in terms of our vision work, I think there's lots we can do, and a great part that we can play in terms of playing into that agenda. Paul, in his earlier session, talked about levelling up. And again, I think he advocated us all to make our voices heard and to step up and play our part, to coin his phrase, to make things happen. And there's no better place or stage to do that, as I see, than within Pro Manchester. But I'm slightly biased as a non-exec board member. Sam Booth and the team have really strong links, both politically and across our regional leadership. So we've got a really strong voice in representing you, championing your cause, repurposing, remodelling, etc., the issues you're facing. So I'd really encourage you all and your teams to really activate and amplify your membership going forward. So certainly step up and allow us to support you with your requirements going forward. And with that in mind, just a quick overview of the Pro Manchester events that we've got coming up. So we've got this is Pro Manchester event on Wednesday the 24th of March, which is an overview of the programme for anybody who's relatively new to Pro Manchester. It's a really great opportunity to come and immerse yourself, understand a little bit more around the benefits and opportunities of membership. And then more from our friends and advocates at Mott MacDonald on the 31st of March, where we've got a lunch and learn session. So again, really encourage you to have a little bit more of a look across what that could provide. And then linked specifically to property, and a little bit further out, we've also got a Property 2022, a customer marketing innovations event on Thursday the 6th of May. So as always, further details on the website. Anything you'd like to see in terms of helping shape the agenda, the things that you'd like to see, then please shout up. That concludes today. Finally, thanks to everybody for joining. Hopefully you got some good value from today's event, and I look forward to seeing you back across our social networks, hopefully in the not too distant future. Thanks everybody, and have a great day.